CFA Society. On behalf of the CFA Society Winnipeg, welcome to the fourth virtual education luncheon of 2022, a discussion on climate change analysis in the investment process. My name is Zach Alderdice, and I'm a member of the programming committee at CFA Society Winnipeg. CFA Society Winnipeg has now served the Winnipeg investment community for 70 years by promoting ethical and professional standards within the investment industry. Our society is an active participant and innovator within our international organization, the CFA Institute. We are also a member of CFA Societies Canada, which promotes advocacy efforts to federal and provincial regulators. In addition, CFA Society Winnipeg provides our members with professional development and educational opportunities, job placement services, and membership and networking events. Today's discussion focuses on ESG, and particularly on how to integrate ESG into the investment process. Matt Orsagh will be joining us from the CFA Institute to discuss his paper, Climate Change Analysis in the Investment Process, diving into the economic effects of climate change, as well as some of the best sources of information and practices that can be used to integrate these effects into qualitative and quantitative analysis. Before turning things over to Matt, I'd like to take this opportunity to share a brief background on him. Matt is a Senior Director of Capital Markets Policy at CFA Institute, where he focuses on corporate governance, ESG, and climate change analysis. He writes and speaks frequently on these topics on behalf of CFA Institute and was the keynote speaker at CFA Winnipeg's Forecast Dinner in 2020. His paper, Climate Change Analysis in the Investment Process, was named Best ESG Paper by Savvy Investor in 2021. Just before we get started, a reminder that we will have some time at the end for questions. However, feel free to send them in as you think of them via the chat bar. Without further ado, I'll hand things over to Matt.
Thanks, Zach, and thanks everyone for joining us today. As Zach said, this whole process kind of started in Winnipeg at the Forecast Dinner I spoke at back in 2020. At that point, I was just starting to write this paper and thinking about it. And that Forecast Dinner was kind of a way to kind of get my thoughts in place about how to frame, the story of climate change and the investment process. And so what I want to do today is hopefully help everyone understand how better to integrate climate change analysis into the investment process, some of the tools to use, some of the challenges, opportunities of doing that. And then I'm happy to take plenty of questions over the last part of this webinar. It's funny that COVID hit right when this paper came out, and so in the normal course of events, I would have been traveling around the world giving talks on this paper, but I've probably done 40, 50 webinars on it instead. So this upstairs attic of mine has got a lot of use giving this presentation. So without further ado, I'll jump into discussing the paper. So climate change is, of course, one of the most pertinent economic issues of our time, and it's going to be so for the coming decades. And so I propose to CFA Institute that we help our members around the world better understand how to integrate climate change analysis in the investment process. And so part of that was writing this paper. If you read the paper, it's not too intimidating. It's about 30, 35 pages, I believe. But the first third of that is my writing and my analysis. And then we have a survey of membership from about 2 years ago. I'll go through that. But I think probably the best part of the report itself are the 10 case studies we had. We partnered with 10 firms from around the world to help people understand how to integrate the how of integrating ESG, or how integrating climate into the investment process. Listening to someone speak or reading a paper on how to do is one thing, but we thought the practical applications of how people are integrating climate in the investment process was the thing that people are most interested in, and maybe that's why it was voted best paper of the year over my writing, but we'll see. The report recommendations, if I lose you through boredom for the rest of the presentation, at least I hope you take away this. The recommendations we have from the paper. A price on carbon markets. We value things that we have a price on. We manage things that we value. So in order to manage carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it would be helpful to have active carbon markets around the world. When I first wrote this paper, about 19 to 20% of all the emissions in the world were covered by some kind of carbon market. I think that's up to about 24, 25% as I last checked. And that's only going to rise in the coming years. Carbon price expectations built into analyst reports. Again, when I started this research for this paper 3 or 4 years ago, it was rare to see analysts baking in into their investment thesis, carbon price analysis unless it was a very carbon intensive industry. And now you're seeing that more and more looking at analyst reports from around the world. Increased transparency disclosures around metrics. At the time that I first wrote this, SASB and TCFD were the standards as far as ESG information, and specifically with TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. I'll get into that in more detail in a little bit. Were the places people went for climate data, and now we have the SEC in the U.S., regulators around the world, including Canada, the ISSB, International Sustainability Standards Board, is likely to put out their final rules for climate disclosures, recommended climate disclosures by public companies. So we've come a long way since just 2 or 3 years ago when I first started researching this. These expectations are going to be baked in, whether in Europe or North America or around the world. The ISSB, the standard, will likely become kind of the baseline of disclosures we have looking forward. Engaging companies on climate risks and opportunities. And again, the TCFD is a great tool for that, and I'll go into that a little bit more. Education within the investment profession. I hope I'm providing a little bit of that now, and I would recommend forwarding on the paper to people who are wanting to learn more about this topic. Not just the paper itself, but I try to include a lot of resources and references to jump down the investment analysis rabbit hole as far as climate change goes. There's a lot of information to dig up. And finally, engaging policymakers. So investors have a seat at the table, whether it's at the European Commission or the SEC or the Canadian regulators or regulators around the world. That investors need information on climate greenhouse gas data to make the most informed investment decisions. We wrote I think it was like 80-page comment letter to the SEC this summer on this topic because we were that concerned about investors having a seat at the table to make sure that our interests and our opinions are part of the process of making policy. And so we can get into better outcomes, so we can better value companies on how they are and aren't managing climate change. A little bit about carbon markets. There's 2 really different kinds of carbon markets you can have. The cap and trade system is what the EU has, for example. Places a cap for total emissions and then trades permits or credits for carbon use. And the idea is that cap will come down slowly over time until you get to net zero, for example. And so the markets can adjust to that, and the price is set by that ceiling put on emissions. Carbon tax is simply a fee applied to each user of greenhouse gases. For example, there would be a tax added to your, at the petrol station, at the gas station, filling up your car. The problem or the challenge of a carbon tax is if it's too high, it can damage the economy, but if it's too low, there's no behavioral change, less use of greenhouse gases. So you really have to get that sweet spot if you're going to have a carbon tax. Stepping into the survey we did of our membership, this was about 2.5 years ago. We had about 3,000 responses, and this was from folks all over the world. About 76% of those surveyed said that it's important, very important to integrate climate change analysis into the investment process. Only about 13% said that having such a view is unimportant. But the interesting part of the survey, and there's like 8 to 10 questions in the survey, I encourage you to look at it for more in-depth analysis. But the big thing that came out of it for us was only 40% of respondents said their firms were incorporating climate change analysis into the investment process. So there's a real gap between the 76, the 3/4 of people who said that this is important or very important, but only 40% are actually doing it. And so that gap, we hope, this is 2.5 years ago. I would imagine that gap is closed somewhat. But that's, I think, the challenge before us, and part of educating our members, educating investors about how to integrate climate into the investment process. It's a new process. It's a cultural change for a lot of people. So I would expect if we did that survey again next year or the year after that, that 40 number would creep a little higher. But we've got to make sure that it gets down, that gap between the 76 and the 40 gets to zero. This is a quote I love about the issue of climate change from Jeremy Grantham. And I talk about this in the paper. The problem of climate change is an issue. And I'll get into the issue of natural capital at the end of the presentation as well. Pardon me. One of the problems with climate change and natural capital issues is there are such long-term issues, and the impacts that we will see are such long-term, and so they tend to get discounted in our dividend discount model world. And Mr. Grantham jokes that according to that model, grandchildren have no value because they can't provide you with anything, except maybe hugs if you're a grandfather. I'm not a grandfather yet, but Mr. Grantham is. And of course, that logic is it's silly logic, to make the point that we need to do a better job of safeguarding the future. So there is a future. There are markets. There are companies to invest in, because if we do nothing and are all on the business as usual climate path, we can have catastrophic things happen where investing, the use of investing is to plan for long-term events such as retirement or saving for college or things like that. And as our environment is degrading, those possibilities become less and less. So we have to think of the future to make sure we have markets, so we have companies to invest in the future. Getting into the physical and transition risks of climate, and I go into more details. This is a report, and there's plenty of resources out there that you can find. And we've all seen more of these in the past couple of years. Increased heat stresses, increased coastal flooding. Not only do glaciers melt and raise sea levels, but warm water expands. So as the ocean gets warmer, it will expand. So the warmer oceans are expanding, and as ice melts, as Greenland melts, as the Thwaites Glacier in Antarctica melts, those heat changes are going to become meter changes over the decades. Increased or more powerful hurricanes and typhoons. The science we all learned in high school of how typhoons work is they get their energy from the water. The warmer the water, the more powerful they are. So the warmer the water is going to be in the future, we can expect more and more powerful hurricanes and typhoons, more extreme weather events. Warm water or warm air holds more moisture, holds more water. So those places that tend to be wet are going to get wetter. Those places that tend to get dry are going to be drier. A practical story I tell is my family has a farm. It's not really a farm, but it's land in Tennessee outside Nashville. And we've been going there, as a family to meet for decades, as long as I can remember. I probably go there every year. And I was there 11 years ago. My wife and I got married on that property. And there was you can't build there because it's a floodplain, but the floodplain is on a creek. That's a creek you usually just walk across. And 11 years ago, they had a 100-year flood that devastated the area. We cleaned it up. It was a month and a half before the wedding, so we cleaned it up in time. And then last year, they had another 100-year flood, 10 years later, the same kind of devastation. So those kind of events are going to, and that's not just my anecdote, but there's many cases of these things happening. More intense flooding, more often, more intense weather, more often is what we should be expecting. Ocean warming and acidification. I think it's, I don't remember if I say it later in the presentation, but, about 20% of humanity gets their protein from the ocean. Gets a lot of their, not only food, but livelihoods from the ocean. And as the ocean heats up, as the water acidifies, those animals, those fish and plankton and zooplankton farther down the food chain, it's harder for them to survive, which of course has a knock-on effect throughout the food web. And so you're going to have less fisheries producing as much, and stresses on marine life. Loss of biodiversity, not only the ocean, but other places as places become unlivable due to heat or the changes in the topography because of forest fires or things like that. We're in the sixth great extinction in the history of Earth, due a lot because of climate change. Loss of habitat, yes, for animals, but for ourselves as well. We're built to not, our temperatures are 98.5 degrees Fahrenheit for a reason. We don't survive very well above that temperature. And there are going to be more and more places around the world that for more and more time around the world are above that temperature. And those places will become unlivable. There's already stories of this past year, places in Pakistan and India and the Middle East where the temperatures, if they continue on the current path they are, the folks that live there will have to move. Loss of food production, staple grains, rice, corn, wheat, soybeans, all are expected to decline in the coming decades because they're used to a certain climate. As that climate's changed, the crops that grow in that certain place will have to be switched out for other things. New places to grow those crops will have to be found, and that'll be disrupted. And all these things lead to a likely large refugee crisis. An example is, I think it was about 4 or 5 million people were displaced by the Syrian civil war about a decade ago. That number is likely to be somewhere around 1 billion to 1.5 billion under business as usual conditions by 2050. You can divide that, to 30 to see that that's quite a big number over the next 30 years or so. Transition risks. Transition risk is simply how our economies will change and how businesses do or do not adapt to that change. You can read reports about electric vehicles, and one of the numbers I've seen again and again is that about half of the North American fleet of cars are expected to be electric by 2035. Now that's a huge transition. If that happens orderly and slowly between now and 2035, that's something that companies can plan for. If that happens in 5 years, it's a whole different story. And supply chains have to adjust more quickly, and it's more disruptive. So that's the main thing to think about when you're thinking about transition risks. I try to put forth some of the tools people can use. As I said before, now the SEC and ISSB and others are putting together policy and regulation around climate disclosures. So I invite people to look in those places as well. But SASB, it's now part of the ISSB, back whenever this report wasn't. But they have a materiality map, and this is just a slide that represents it. But you can go down the columns, and those are the different issues, and go across the rows. Go down the row, and that's down the first column of the different issues, and across those columns are the different sectors: consumption, financials, healthcare, and so on. And where there's a red square is where that issue is pertinent, very material to that industry. So the first row across is greenhouse gas emissions, and that first red square is non-renewable resources, oil and gas. Of course, it's a very material to those companies. The orange is where it is material, but not quite as material as it is, to the ones in the red. And where it's white, it's not much of a material issue. So that's a good way for an analyst or investor to start looking at these things, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions or other issues. So the ones they list here: air quality, energy management, all the way down. This is looking at the TCFD task force for climate-related financial disclosures. And it's a good way, if you're an investor, to see how a company or industry is or isn't managing climate. The first column looks at governance, the second looks at strategy, the third looks at process for identifying risks, and the last is metrics and targets. And what I found is This is a way investors are using to engage with companies. They want to know how climate is governed. What's the strategy around it? What's the process they have for managing it? What targets are they using? And so in those conversations, they can compare a Coke to a Pepsi or a UPS to a FedEx, or someone who's a laggard to what they're seeing elsewhere in the industry, and hopefully work with those companies to improve what they're doing around climate. And right now, the TNFD, Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, are looking at the same model to build out the same kind of model for natural capital and biodiversity, and expect that to come out to be finalized next year. And I'll touch on that at the end of the presentation. What investors can do, as I said, educate yourself on the economics of climate change to understand the implications of a heating world, what it means for the companies you're investing in, the markets you invest in, as well as your everyday life. To perform this analysis, investors, we need better data, reporting standards around climate and climate data. When I remember going to Bloomberg back in 2005, 2006 in New York offices, and meeting with the team there, who was excited that they were just starting to put governance data on the Bloomberg terminal. And now, they have thousands of fields of ESG data, and it's because investors demand it. Bloomberg is not a not-for-profit organization. They're there providing this information because investors are increasingly integrating this information into their investment process, and climate is no different. And things like natural capital will come along and be no different as well. And engage with companies and policymakers to inform best practices. It's really a three-legged stool when looking at climate change analysis in the investment process. We as a financial industry have a responsibility to get the best information to make the best decisions and to do the job of finance, which is to efficiently allocate capital. But it's another leg of that stool was companies integrating climate into their strategy, and then finally policymakers, regulators, to make sure that we have the information we need as investors, and demanding the right information from companies. That's not too onerous, but something they can manage that helps us make more informed decisions. I don't have it in the slide presentation, I apologize, but I wanted to talk briefly, before I get into materiality, I want to talk briefly about the case studies that are part of the report. We partnered with 10 different firms from around the world. The model we used was one, if you're not satisfied with just reading this report, you can go back and read the reports we did with PRI, Principles of Responsible Investment. About 5-6 years ago, we went around the world to see how people were integrating ESG into the investment process, to recommend best practices, to help them understand if their market was doing something different than other markets, what were the best ways to integrate ESG in the investment process. And again, this is 5 or 6 years ago, and we ended up writing 3 different reports, one in each region, about what's going on with ESG integration in the investment process. But we also did 33 case studies. Well, we didn't do them. We partnered with companies around the world about how they integrated ESG into the investment process. And that's a fantastic resource as well. Just look up case studies, PRI, CFA Institute, ESG integration. And it's from equities to bonds to credit rating agencies, how they're integrating in a practical way ESG analysis into the investment process. It's not just using an MSCI screen, it's actually how they in-house integrate ESG into the investment process, because we thought that would be a great tool for investors. And that's the same thing we did here. We wanted people to say, how are you integrating climate into your portfolio construction, into your engagement, into credit ratings. We have a case study on forestry, and how forestry as an asset is used in climate change analysis. And then last year, that was 2 years ago, we did this report, and the 10 case studies are in that. And then last year, we added 5 more case studies that you can find on our website to integrate climate change analysis into the investment process. I'm currently writing a report that's going to the printer in the next couple of weeks on natural capital and how to integrate natural capital into the investment process. And I imagine CFAs will likely be doing the same in the future, putting up case studies, partnering with firms on case studies of how to integrate natural capital into the investment process. A word on materiality. We're currently working on a report on materiality. We partnered with, we spoke to, because of COVID, we didn't travel around the world, but we spoke to over 70 different people from around the world about the issue of materiality, of climate data, of ESG data. And we found that materiality, and materiality, definition of materiality being what an informed investor would choose to integrate into the investment process because they think it has an impact, a meaningful impact on that business, on that company. And we found that materiality is often in the eye of the beholder, the time, the investment horizon, asset class, risk profile, industry, all will determine whether something's material to that investor or not. Global coordination on this issue will be difficult. There's not going to be a materiality standard in Canada. It's the same as it is in Brazil. It's the same as it is in Singapore. And I really recommend that each firm know how to do this for themselves. I started a podcast at CFA Institute called The Sustainability Story. Some of you may be familiar with it, but I just interviewed last week, and it'll be the podcast coming out, I believe, next week, someone from a firm where they pioneered integrating materiality into the investment process. So I encourage you, if you're interested more in the issue of materiality, to listen to that when it comes out next week. They realize that they need to define for themselves and walk through the difficult process of figuring out, okay, how do we, as our asset management firm, determine materiality? We can't rely on one definition from one source or another, because we have to decide for ourselves, what do we believe is material and how do we measure that? Briefly on the issue of double materiality, the materiality we're used to is how does the environment impact a company? The example I give is, if you're Coca-Cola or a beer company, you need to know how the water is available and where you operate, because that's a main input to what you're doing. The other arrow of that materiality going the other way is, how does that soft drink company, how does it, a beverage company, a beer company, impact the society around it, the places around it? It's a big issue in mining and oil and gas exploration. Access to those resources, but also how is the land left afterwards? How is the community left afterwards? And more and more investors integrating that double materiality into the investment process. Excuse me. And it's getting to this kind of integration is getting into something I don't call, other folks have called it systems level investing or systems level thinking. And systems level thinking is simply realizing that all the systems that operate in our world, whether it's the healthcare system, markets, government, and so on, are interconnected and have impacts on each other. For example, the issue of cigarettes and lung cancer over the years everywhere. But my experiences in North America is in the United States. Is yes, a tobacco company can be a very profitable business, but that has knock-on effects that are negative for healthcare, for productivity of companies, and so on. And so how all those systems interact, and how does materiality of one issue impacts possibly a whole different industry. And then the issue of dynamic materiality is just realizing that what we consider material will change over time. We're having this discussion about climate change today because climate change is something we all want to do a better job of integrating in the investment process. But 20 years ago, it wasn't something really discussed or thought about much in the investment process. And that will evolve and change over time as well. And another issue that I've talked about as we've gone through this presentation is natural capital. And I think natural capital is something you'll be hearing. Biodiversity and natural capital is something you'll be hearing in the coming years. It's about 3 or 4 years kind of behind where climate change was in people's minds. Like I said, the TNFD, who you see here in the middle, this graphic in the middle, is the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures. They have kind of a beta of their standard out now. I invite you to look at it if you're interested in it. That they're happy to get comments back from people. If you can get through the 40 page report I wrote, the economics of biodiversity, the Dust Group review came out about a year or two ago, I think 2 years ago. I think it's about 800 pages long, but it goes into great detail on just an introduction to this issue of the economics of biodiversity and how we use and don't use and depend on natural capital, whether it's fisheries or lumber or clean water or clean air or land use. But don't worry, only about, I think there's about 100 pages of footnotes. So I think it's only about 700 pages, but there's an executive summary you can read as well. And the main number I remember from that report is that we're currently using our natural resources of Earth as though we had 1.6 Earths to use, which is definition of unsustainable. And we're starting to hit, with climate change and other planetary boundaries. And I encourage you to look up the issue of planetary boundaries and jump a little bit into that. You'll be hearing more about those issues in the future as we learn that we need to, husband those resources better. So we get down to a place where you're only using one Earth because we only have one. And I think that's going to be an issue soon after climate change that you're going to be hearing a lot more about. Investors will look for ways to integrate it in the investment process more, as will companies, as will regulators. And if you're ahead of the game on those issues as an investor, you'll do better for yourself and your clients. So that's all I have for now. I'm happy to take people's questions. And back to you, Zach.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Matt. I appreciate it. I already have a few questions in the chat box, but if anybody else has any questions, please feel free to send them in now. So first question is just on climate change votes at company AGMs. So just maybe wanting to understand a little bit more on how effective you think they are and kind of your opinion on them essentially, and how familiar you are with them, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, that gets into the divestment question as well. That's part of that whole question. As I came up in the corporate governance world about 22 years ago, reading more proxy statements than anyone should ever have to, and it's led me into and that corporate governance world led into the ESG, sustainability, climate, natural capital world, and I've seen this develop over the years. And I think there were early on when people really started caring about climate votes and you started seeing climate votes, there was more of a discussion of, just divest. People just wanted to divest. And there was a lot of protests and organizing at universities, for example, at least here in the United States, I remember, about divesting from oil and gas companies. Well, the problem with that is if you divest, then that asset is sold to someone else who may not have your concerns about fossil fuels. And so when you own the assets and you have a vote, you can sit down with the company if you have a large enough percentage of the shares. If you have 10 shares, probably not. But the Toronto Teachers Pension Plan is going to get a meeting, whereas you and I won't. So as more and more investors have concerns about these issues and are voting on these issues, they're using things like the TCFD model I showed in the presentation to engage with companies and say, okay, what is your net zero plan by 2050? We all know that we're moving at some speed. It just depends on the speed to a low carbon to no carbon environment, not tomorrow, but over the coming decades. So ExxonMobil or any Shell or any company, what is your plan for that? As an investor, I want to know your plan for that, because if you don't have a plan and your competitor does, that's going to affect me as a shareholder. And so I'm seeing less talk of divestment these days and more about engagement because there are more votes on climate. And I think you'll see that continue. And I think you'll see engagement continue. And it gets into that transition risk that we talked about before. I remember seeing an interview with, I don't remember who it was, but it was a CEO of one of the big, big oil and gas companies. It may have been Exxon, it may have been Shell, I can't recall. But the CEO said that, he fully expects that by 2035, half of the fleet will be electric vehicles, and they have to plan for that. They can't ignore that. That's something they can see coming 13 years down the road. So they have to manage for that. And so if I'm a large shareholder of that company, I'm like, no, that's good to hear. Now, what's your plan? And I think you're seeing more engagement. You're seeing more investment and engagement from investors and companies because they realize that this isn't, this is just because, this is the one case of oil and gas industry, but it's the same where there's other problems, whether it's, labor in the garment industry or whatever it may be. There's going to be different issues that are going to come more to light, and so you have to manage them. You have to have a plan for them. And I think engagement 20 years ago when I started out was something that didn't happen very well, and certainly not at the board level. Investors weren't meeting with board members, but that's not the case anymore, especially for large high-profile companies. They want to meet with, the Vanguards of the world and the BlackRocks of the world, and the Toronto teachers, of the world. It's free consulting for them, and these people are relatively informed about those issues, and they know these issues are becoming more and more important, so they have to manage them. So I would expect this only to increase. I would expect support for these climate votes really to depend on how much the company is engaging with how that company is engaging with share owners and what their plan is. If investors are convinced they have a good plan and a good way forward, those votes against whatever that is will be low. And if the company doesn't have a good plan, those votes against will likely be high.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Our next question is just on COVID-19 and the reduction in emissions globally. So, have you seen any data on how much time this brought us towards the net zero goal for 2050? And is there any evidence that the change in humans' habits, so work from home, less travel, etc., are helping us to get closer to that target?
I remember seeing data that yes, emissions went down. Of course, people travel less. People are zooming. Like I said, it would have, after this paper came out in 2020, ironically on climate change. Normally, I would have been traveling around the world to give talks on it. And like I said, I've probably done 50 or 60 Zoom meetings on the paper, which, yes, has lowered my carbon footprint some. So yes, there is some impact there, but it's marginal as far as the total emissions. Getting back to that 1.6 number I used for talking about natural capital. That includes, climate change is one of the issues, one of the 9 planetary boundaries. And I encourage you, if you're interested in natural capital, to look up, planetary boundaries and educate yourself more on that. And the paper will be coming out in the next couple months. We'll talk more about that. But we're using our resources as though we had unlimited resources. And of course we don't. And there's no new continent to conquer to get resources from. There's no new ocean to get more fish from. We have more carbon dioxide in our atmosphere than we can use, or we have too much. That the oceans and plankton in the sea and trees in the ground can't suck up another because there's too much. So we need to change, the 2050 goals that companies have and countries have, good, but they're only one part of really a 2-step process. And it's eliminating, those greenhouse gases warming the atmosphere. But it's also, we have to find a way to take out, it's really a 3-step process. We have to find a way to take out the greenhouse gases beyond what the oceans can handle, beyond what trees and plankton in the ocean can handle. And then we have to change our way of living so that after 2050, it doesn't just, we're just not in this cycle again. So that's going to take a change in the way we do things. So we get down to that 1.0 type number for the amount of resources we use. And something, something I'm seeing more, reading more and more about, seeing more and more about is, and it goes by a couple different names, but the degrowth movement is, and what degrowth is all about is shrinking the economy. And I know that sounds scary for finance people, but so we get to a sustainable level of development and growth. Doesn't mean no growth, but it means we shrink things so we get down to that 1.0 number. So things like private jets, maybe frowned upon in that type of world. Thinking we can think of, like eating meat. I'm not a vegetarian. My wife is, so I generally am a vegetarian most of the time at home. But just doing the analysis on the beef industry, for example, it uses far more water, far more energy, and produces far more greenhouse gases than any other protein, whether it's chicken or fish or plant protein. So, and in the paper I'm writing right now, there's a you can look this up. There's a chart that looks up land use in the United States, and there's a huge square in the middle of it. They cordon off different sections for land use in the United States. There's a teeny little section for golf courses, a teeny little section for schools and hospitals. And there's a quarter of the country in the United States, the land use is for pasture land, for grazing animals. And, it's amazing to see. And I would anticipate that in the future, as people see more of that, realize more of that, that people's habits will change and policy will likely change because beef production uses an inordinate amount of resources, water and land, and pollutes more. And so we as a society have to decide, do we want less of that? And I would imagine over time people will. Not that I love a good burger or a good steak as much as the next person, but you see, where the trade-off is in your economic, benefit. Same with, an issue you can point to smoking. I've never been a smoker, but I've had friends who have, and they like it, but they know it's bad for them. And so I would anticipate over time, capitalism will evolve to become something else. That's not going to happen tomorrow, but over the next 20, 30 years, it will. And I would encourage people to read more up on degrowth. Actually, in the podcast I did, I'm not trying to plug my podcast too much, but I talked to a professor, this French gentleman, Tim Barik, who's teaching in Sweden. He is actually, I think he's coming out with a book this week. It's in French, so you have to speak French to read it. But I did a podcast with where he speaks English, and it was very informative for me. And I got a lot of great feedback from it, from people to try to understand more about what degrowth is and isn't. And how to try to manage an economy more for what we need than just chasing ever expanding GDP in a world with finite resources. If you stop and think about it, we measure our progress as countries on GDP, don't we? The economic report comes out every month. It's how much did GDP grow? That's unsustainable over the long term. We don't have enough resources to continuously grow GDP. In some countries, Iceland, New Zealand, and some others, and some cities have started to measure their progress on a dashboard of different indicators, life expectancy, health, along with GDP and other things. And so I would anticipate you're going to see more of that kind of conversation and more of a less emphasis on growth for growth's sake, and more of an emphasis on how is this growth we need? Is this growth useful? Growth in the use of private jets is an increase in GDP. I'm not trashing anyone who uses a private jet, but in the current environment, we need that less than we need other things. And I would anticipate those kind of discussions happening more and more often.
Great, thanks, Matt. Next question is a bit on standards and standardization of data. So obviously on the financial side of things, we have 10Ks, we have 10Qs, and it's a fairly standard amount of financial data that every company shares. In your opinion, do you think it's a space where something like the SEC should be more involved in setting those standards, or is it better to leave it to industry to kind of decide what pieces of data should be shared and how to prioritize them?
Yeah, again, I think this gets back to kind of that three-legged stool, and I think investors need to be, constantly talking with companies and policymakers. All three parts of that leg of that stool need to get together to agree on that. Because if we don't, it's going to be imposed on us by, uh, there's pushback here in the United States a lot on regulation and disclosure for ESG metrics. And what I tell people when they have that side of the argument, I say, well, that's okay, but all the companies you invest in, for the most part, are international companies, and they operate in Europe, where they're setting standards on disclosures on ESG information, ESG data. So if you choose not to do anything on policy or regulation, you're outsourcing that to Europe for those areas. And so it really behooves, everybody who's part of that, whether it's in New Zealand or South Africa or Canada or wherever, to get involved in those processes. And that's why one of the recommendations we have is investors to have a seat at the table with policymakers and have discussions with policymakers. And why we wrote an 80-page comment letter to the SEC, because it's that this is the information on climate change we as investors want. These are the concerns we have. This is what we think will work, what won't work. This is where we think the information should be, and all those things. And we weren't the only ones. It was a record number of submissions the SEC got on the climate change disclosures. And the ISSB, International Sustainability Standards Board, is going to come out with their own recommendations. And I expect the ISSB to kind of be the baseline for climate disclosures. They started with climate, but they're going to work on natural capital issues as well, and other non-financial issues, as they've historically been called as well. So eventually, whether you're in India or in Pakistan or in Nigeria or in South Africa or wherever, you're going to have some kind of standard on disclosure. It's likely the ISSB standard will be a baseline, and then whether France wants to have a more rigorous standard or Canada does, that's going to be up to the local regulators. But I encourage investors to get involved in at least understanding that process, and if possible, meeting with policymakers and companies to be a part of it. Because if you're not a part of it, it's going to be imposed on you without your input.
Perfect. Thank you. Next question. So, what do you think it will take for corporations to invest in the R&D required for us to move to a circular economy? Is it regulations? Is it heavy taxes and penalties? Or what other ideas would really spur companies along to make this kind of a priority?
That's a good question, and I think that gets into the kind of the degrowth argument I mentioned before. Is okay. That's a nice utopian thought, but how do you get there, right? That's difficult. But I think that gets back to investors, engaging with companies. But it's also going to come from our decisions as people in society. Like the beef industry, I guess dairies is along in that as well. I've already seen stories and anecdotal evidence, and I'd be curious what the numbers are behind it, of people moving away from eating meat as much. And to further plug my podcast, but this gets into a practical example of the issues. I was talking to someone last year on the issue of water and water use, and they're an expert in water use. And we were talking about the issues of the Colorado River here in the United States, and how the Colorado River Compact, I'm not sure if that's what it's called, but it was written about 100 years ago. And it set out what states can use what amounts of water, what proportions of water from the Colorado River. So many cities out west in the United States get their water from the Colorado River. And in doing the research for that podcast, I came across an article where they had a scientist, talking to the author and saying that if well, I grew up, I'm Catholic. I grew up Catholic in the United States, and I remember at school on Fridays, during Lent, you wouldn't have meat. You weren't supposed to have meat on Fridays in Lent. So the example this gentleman gave was, if everybody in the United States went meatless on Fridays, the problem of the Colorado River would be solved, because of the water use, because the dairy industries and beef industries are by far and away the hugest users of such a big use of water in those industries, that if the demand from us as consumers fell by 1/7, there wouldn't be the stress on the Colorado River there was. And so maybe that changes over time due to consumer demands and sentiments. Maybe, in that example, people realize the beef industry has an outsized impact on these issues. Maybe it's taxed more. Maybe there's incentives for people to move to plant-based proteins or less, less intense proteins. But you can see that kind of thing in many industries. And the legislation that just passed in the United States last month, I think is a good down payment on climate change. But more will need to be done. But it's to get incentives to people to use more solar, to use more wind, to upgrade the energy efficiency of their homes and appliances. And so, I always argue that we're very simple creatures as humans. We do what we're incentivized to do. And so that's where policy and regulation comes into place, where if you place incentives on the behaviors you need, whether it's by incentives or taxes or whatever it may be, that goes part of the way. But I think too often people think, investors think, oh, well, that's a policymakers' problem. Policymakers will say, well, companies need to solve that. And companies will say, oh, our investors aren't demanding that. And so all parts of that stool, and we as consumers need to do our part, see what's happening, see the impacts an industry is or isn't having on the world, and try to manage those, whether it's the beef industry or oil and gas industry or the cigarette industry or anything that has an externality on our lives that isn't being paid for, that's having a detrimental effect on water or climate. We need to find a better way to manage this. And it's not as easy as saying it's just a tax that will solve that. It's just consumer demand. It's a combination of all those things.
Perfect. I think our last question is a bit of a follow-up from the first question. But how should a company respond to a negative say on climate change vote?
It's kind of like the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The best time to deal with that is, meeting that investor, a year ago to make sure that doesn't become a problem. And so I've been very heartened to see over the past 5 years, especially the 10 years. Like I said, when I first started in this business, it was unheard of for investors, board members to engage with investors. But even, it's still pretty rare for companies to engage on a large scale with investors. And I've seen both companies and investors invest in more people to do that because they see the value in it. If you have a conversation if your biggest shareholder is BlackRock, for example, and they have a team of 100 ESG and sustainability professionals, and they're going to know what you are and aren't doing, whether it's oil and gas or water use or whatever it may be. You can't just ignore the issues that are there in your industry. You can use things like the SASB materiality map and TCFD to better understand how you're managing those things. And so you need to have a relationship with that investor to understand what their concerns are and aren't, so you can address them, miles before it gets to a vote. It gets to a negative vote. So the best thing to do is make sure that doesn't happen. But if you get a negative vote, you need to understand why. You need to understand why and be honest about engaging with those investors, because the problem isn't going to go away, especially if it's a climate problem or a natural capital problem. Those things are only going to be, especially climate. You saw those physical risks; those aren't going away. They're just going to become more tense in the coming years. So they need to be managed. And so getting ahead of them and managing them is really the best strategy. And if you get to that point of negative vote, well, that says that you haven't done that adequately. And so you need to fix that and engage with those investors before that's the case. I remember we were doing a project about 10 years ago, and one of the people who was part of the project, she worked for an oil and gas company, and her job was, she was the head of investor relations. Her job was, the first thing on her job that she knew she had to do was she met with the top 25 investors every year, no matter what was happening, no matter if everything was great and they were happy, or if there was a problem, because she knew she had to have those relationships with those investors so it never got to a contentious vote issue.
Perfect. Well, I think that's all the questions we have for today. That was a lot of great information and insight, and I'm sure I speak for everyone here when I say it's much appreciated. So thanks again to Matt for joining us today. Hopefully we get to see you again soon. As an expression of our appreciation, the CFA Society Winnipeg will be making a donation in your name to Youth Employment Services, otherwise known as Yes Manitoba, a local nonprofit organization dedicated to helping youth enhance their skills, find and retain employment, all services that our society needs now more than ever. Thank you, as always, to Ava Swan for helping to set this event up, and thank you all for taking the time to join us virtually today. Stay tuned for our future events, and I hope to see you all soon.
Thanks, everybody.